I hate being between people and their lunch, so I will try to go quickly. I was tasked with talking to you about Canadian Confederation, and so I was very ordered in my focus of what to choose to talk to you about, because I thought, okay, I'm going to talk about something from 1867, and as I started thinking about it, there wasn't one building or one thing that I could bring forward for the discussion. I mean, with your map, Michael, the Boulton map, it's 1858, so you have a document to look at. And when you think of 1867, you don't have a specific building to think of, and it made me think, well, could I do something in the afternoon session, because there's so much to talk about in terms of the centennial of Confederation, where there were buildings and programs across the country from coast to coast to coast. You had new architecture, and so there's lots to talk about there, including the Science Center, which is shown there. And when you look at, as in a study of architecture across Canada, if you look at all of the buildings that were constructed at the time of the centennial of Confederation, you do see a pattern. You see a certain quality about them. There's this immediate architectural connection. And so I'm sitting thinking, okay, what am I going to talk about? There's no immediate architectural connection to 1867, to Confederation. And I'll show you what I mean, because that connection is, there's no one building that I could show you. Now, a lot of people might say, well, of course, we have the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, but these are buildings that were, especially in this image I show you, which is pre-fire, these were buildings that were planned, designed, and began construction before Canada became a country. These were for the province of Canada as opposed to the Dominion of Canada. And it certainly became a building that was then very important at the time of Confederation, but it wasn't planned for that reason or designed for that reason. Closer to home, given that this is a group on Toronto architecture, closer to home, we have, again, the Parliament buildings, but these were the Parliament buildings for Upper Canada. They were built in 1832, and then the government that came into power, or that was formed in 1867 upon the Act and the establishment of the Dominion of Canada, and therefore the province of Ontario, the province simply appropriated these existing Parliament buildings from 1832. So neither of these government buildings is actually a building that I could say this marks Confederation in 1867. But one of the outcomes of the Act of Confederation in 1867 was the establishment of the Department of Public Works. And specifically, I want to talk about, well, right now, the Department of Public Works for Ontario. So Confederation happens July 1st, 1867. This act was passed, as you can see, in January 1869. So as with all things governmental, it took a while, took a year and a half before there was a Department of Public Works. So before there would be an architecture that I could show you that would be focused from that period of Confederation. And what it did is it gave the newly appointed Lieutenant Governor of the newly created province of Ontario, it gave him the power to appoint an architect for all public works. And the first architect of the Provincial Department of Public Works was Kivas Tully. Kivas Tully was an architect who was well known across the province and had done many important buildings in the 1850s and 1860s. So he comes into this role as the architect of this new body that was founded through the means of Confederation. And the first project that Kivas Tully undertakes is not a new design, not a new building, not a building, again, that I can say this represents Canadian Confederation architecture. Rather, his first job was to undertake repairs on the Parliament buildings that were had come into the possession of the province of Ontario, but had been built well before that. And these were barely 30-year-old buildings, and they were in quite a poor state of repair in the 1860s. The lighting is a bit bad here, you can't see very well, but this photograph is from 1890, just before they were demolished, and it really wasn't a very impressive piece of architecture. They were brick buildings. Really, the only time that they looked impressive was when artists painted them or drew them and took artistic license and added a very grand classical portico on a building that never actually had a portico on it. So it wasn't necessarily, again, that building that comes to mind. So the other building that came under the Department of Public Works was this government house. Now this was, again, it was an unfinished building, was already designed when Canada became a country and Ontario became a province. This was designed and construction had started to be the residence of the Vice-Regal of Upper Canada. And again, when the province of Ontario was formed in 1867, it simply came under their purview, and it was going to be the first home, the home for the first lieutenant governor, as opposed to the vice-regal. And so Tully was responsible for overseeing the completion of this building, because it was already under construction. Now, this piece of architecture, which unfortunately a lot of what I'm showing you today is lost to us, and I can only show it to you in photographs. This building was designed by Gundry and Langley, an architectural firm that many of you probably know here in Toronto. And Henry Langley said specifically about this building something I think is significant. He was talking about the style of the architecture, and he described it as being, and I quote, "in the modern French style of architecture, the modern French style of architecture which has been adapted largely in American cities and is rapidly gaining favor in England." Now we today know as this French modern style, we know it as the Second Empire style. They didn't refer to it as the Second Empire style in the day. It simply was called this modern French style. And it was, of course, the style of the Second Empire in France. Napoleon III, when he comes into power, he starts recreating Paris. This is during the time of the Haussmannization of Paris. So that period, the Second Empire period, creates an architecture that has these characteristics, these qualities that you see in this building, and was starting to be found in North America and in Toronto. The first example of the Second Empire style of architecture in North America was the Boston City Hall. The most well-known example of Second Empire style architecture is the State War and Navy building in Washington, D.C. You see this on the news all the time. And then the first example of Second Empire style in the Dominion of Canada is this building, this government house. And of course, again, all of you know the common stylistic characteristics with the mansard roof, that very sculptural quality, the breaking of the planes, the picturesque roof lines. So this became a very popular style at this time. And Henry Langley became an architect who was sought after in this period right around the time of Canadian Confederation, because he was very adept at this stylistic idiom. And 4 years later, he was awarded a commission to design, again, unfortunately demolished, to design Toronto's post office, the 8th post office. So this is on Adelaide Street, right at the head of Toronto Street. And I say it was a prestigious award because this was the first and the most expensive to date building that the Department of Public Works, the Federal Department of Public Works, was undertaking. So this was a very important building from a federal position after Confederation. And I just want to tell you a brief story about the design of this building. In 1870, a design was prepared and submitted to the federal government saying this is the design that would be suitable for your new post office. That design no longer survives. We just have textual documentation. And what we do know is that the design that was submitted was by the same architect who designed this very famous Washington building, and that's Alfred Mullett. Alfred Mullett was the head architect of the Treasury Department of the United States. So he submitted a design for Toronto's post office to the federal government. We don't have that drawing, but what we do have is Henry Langley's early drawing of the post office, and you can see the similarity to Alfred Mullett's architecture that we do have an example of, which is this building in Washington. And I'm not showing you the comparison between Langley and Mullett. This is Mullett's post office in New York, Langley's early design for the post office in Toronto. I'm not saying that Langley was copying Mullett or even the other way around. In fact, I started to think about the fact that when you look at architecture in Toronto, we always think it's derivative. In the early days, it was derivative of Britain. And then at the turn of the century, it was always derivative of the United States, and we were doing Richardsonian, Romanesque, and Beaux-Arts. And I don't think that in this case it's actually derivative. I think these are two architects in two different countries working with the same architectural style at the same time. Neither one was being drawn into it by the other. It was a modern style for the time, and I think that's why it is showing itself in these buildings. So Henry Langley leaves two buildings that were typical of the Second Empire style. The thing is, it was a very short-lived style. So we only have it here from 1870 to the 1880s. That's the only time you'll see Second Empire architecture. But even though it was short-lived, I think it's a clear indication that the government wanted to define the architecture of its new, of this new country through this stylistic quality. And I think there's a striking difference between the architecture that we see here from the 1860s and 1870s and what preceded it, where we have neoclassicism, Gothic revival. So these are styles that came from the past. The Second Empire is a style that's current. It was very fashionable. That's what Napoleon III at the very time was doing throughout Paris, creating this image of his empire through architecture. And this is what's happening in Canada and the United States as well. And it's even more clear when a statement from the government that you can read in the documentation, when in reference to the Toronto Post Office, they mentioned that this would be a general plan applicable to all post offices to be hereafter built in the Dominion. So that's a clear indication by the government that this is the style that they would like to see. And I think that it's the style was saying something about who we were as a country, how we were a new country, and progressing and portraying a very public image of that optimism, self-assurance, and ambition that you see in these types of buildings. And with those characteristics in mind, this ambition and modernism, it's not unusual that you would find this style being prevalent during the French Second Empire, during the American period when they've just come out of the American Civil War, and General Grant has taken on the Second Empire as their architecture of choice, and where Canada is using this right at the time of the centennial. And so the Second Empire, as I say, short-lived, but a number of buildings were constructed through the 1870s and 1880s here in Toronto with all of these characteristics. And the buildings tend to have a connection to economic prosperity, like banks, or to people who gained their wealth through the economy, and that is, say, a businessman such as George Beardmore, or even one of the fathers of Confederation, George Brown, using the Second Empire style at that time to convey this kind of quality that comes out of that architecture. So there clearly was a very short period of kind of a set design that you would qualify as the architecture at the time of Confederation. I don't think it had the same architectural splash as did the Centennial of Confederation, where you have these celebratory pieces of architecture that represent a moment in time. And nothing could be more celebratory than Expo, and I think we're hearing about that this afternoon. And it made me think that even though Confederation was a huge celebration, this clip from a 19th century publication, you can see that they had bonfires, fireworks, illuminations, and musical entertainment. There was a celebration, but it wasn't a concrete one. There wasn't a building built as part of that celebration. And as I was putting together this talk, it made me really start to think, is this when the first time that Canada, as a country, because it was just founded in 1867, is this the first time that we as Canadians had an identity crisis and not knowing who we are and what our architectural style was? And I think maybe that's something I'm going to keep looking at now that I've thought about it. So thank you for listening.